Before we start today's case, I would like to thank the sponsor of this video, Surfshark. If you don't already know, Surfshark VPN is a really great service which keeps you safe online and protects your personal data. This means that you can surf the internet protected from unfamiliar eyes, which is great, especially if you are researching some of the cases that I have to look at. By using Surfshark VPN, you can unblock streaming services from other countries, allowing anyone to watch their favourite series, even if it's unavailable in their location. This really does come in handy when you're abroad. Also, Surfshark VPN is an essential way to protect yourself online. Hackers and online theft are all too common now, so if you want to avoid unfamiliar stress, Surfshark has you covered. And thanks to its clean web feature, Surfshark blocks ads, trackers, malware, and phishing attempts, allowing you to surf the web completely protected. Don't miss out on this great opportunity. Make sure to get Surfshark VPN by clicking the link below and enter promo code briefcaseuk for 83% off and 3 months extra free. Today we are looking at a case from the late 19th century. So sit back as we go to the USA. Elva Zona Heaster was born in 1873 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. She was the oldest of 3 children, born to Jacob Hedges Hester and Mary Jane Hester, and was always referred to by her middle name, Zona. Not much is known about her young life, but her parents did their best to make sure that their only daughter was polite and well-mannered. She grew up to be a very attractive young lady, and in 1895 found herself in a situation that in the late 19th century young ladies were always warned to be very wary of: pregnant and unmarried. In November of the same year, when she was aged 22, she gave birth to her baby. Around the same time, a gentleman named Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe moved to the area. He was born in 1861 in Mount Solon in Augustus County in Virginia, but when he was young, he moved to Droop Mountain. He was the 4th of 9 children, born to Jacob and Elizabeth Stribling Trout Shoe, and more than 11 years older than Zona. At some stage, Erasmus had changed his name to Edward, but when he arrived in Greenbrier County, everyone just referred to him as Trout. He worked as a blacksmith, a trade that he had been taught by his father, and soon caught the attention of the young ladies in the area. He was quite tall, slim, and handsome. He was also known to be quite charming. He did, however, have somewhat of a mysterious past. In 1885, he married a lady named Esterline Cutlip Macmillan, and in 1887 they had a daughter who they named Gertrude Lucrezia. However, the marriage did not last, and they divorced in 1889. Although divorce was rare, there had been a steady increase in the number of divorced couples in the United States, and by 1890, 3 in every 1,000 marriages ended in divorce. This number was far greater than in Europe, probably because the legal process had been less expensive, and divorce had become more accepted as a far better alternative to an unhappy marriage. The Married Women's Property Act was passed in 1839 and had been amended at various times. It gave divorced women far greater rights, and in some cases allowed them to be able to sue for divorce. Following the separation of Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe and his wife, their daughter Gertrude was brought up by her grandparents, Mr. James and Mrs. Emily Cutlip. The rumours about Trout, however, were centred around his second wife, as in 1894 he married Lucy Ann Tritt. She was only 16 years old, having been born on the 19th of April 1878, so 17 years younger than her new husband. By all accounts, she was a very pleasant young lady, but within months of the marriage, Lucy had died, and the cause of her death was surrounded in mystery. One story emerged that she had been poisoned, another that she was pregnant and had slipped on ice. One popular version as to what had happened to her was that Trout accidentally dropped a large object like a brick while working on his house, and it unfortunately landed on her head. She died from the injuries. These stories were easy to fabricate, and there was no official cause of death recorded for poor Lucy Ann Tritt. After Lucy had died, Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe was arrested for stealing a horse, and after a short trial, he was sent to prison for some time. He came to Greenbrier County, hoping that he could put his past behind him. It was now 1896, The economy was still in a poor state. It had not improved very much since the Depression of the early 1890s. Unemployment had increased to 14.5%, and the National Bank of Illinois failed, which brought great uncertainty to the financial markets. In Greenbrier, however, Trout was able to find work in his profession as a blacksmith. Elva Zona Heaster visited the blacksmith in the summer of 1896 and soon became fascinated by the handsome man working at the forge. She needed no excuse to go back and would visit whenever she was able. It became obvious to the people of Greenbrier County that young Zona seemed to be very much infatuated with him, and a courtship soon followed. However, it was a surprise to many that on the 20th of October 1896, just 3 months after meeting, Miss Elva Zona Heaster and Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe were married, something that very much displeased Zona's mother, Mrs. Mary Jane Heaster. The couple lived in a log house, and life for Trout continued as normal. He would work as many hours as he was able, while Zona would go to the market, cook and clean. He did, however, hire a neighbour's 11-year-old son to assist her with the chores and run errands whenever his wife needed assistance. On the 23rd of January 1897, the young boy went to the house of Mrs. Trout Shoe to see if she needed anything as he was going to the market. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He thought it strange, as he knew that she was always home at this time. The door was ajar, so he pushed it open. It all seemed very quiet, and as he entered the hallway, to his horror, he saw a lady lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs. It was Mrs. Trout Shoe. The young boy ran back to fetch his mother, who immediately sent for the local doctor, a gentleman named Dr. George W. Knapp. Dr. Knapp took some time to arrive to the log house, and when he did, Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe had already returned. He had taken his wife's body up the stairs to the bedroom, where he had washed her and dressed her in a high-necked dress ready for burial. He had also placed a veil over her face. The doctor insisted that he inspect the body, as he needed to ascertain the cause of death. But Mr. Trout Shoe would not leave his wife's side. He seemed to be very distressed, and each time the doctor tried to do a more thorough examination, he would break down with grief, making the doctor's task increasingly more difficult. Eventually, Dr. Knapp left the house, unable to complete his assessment, and reported the death as an everlasting faint. He later changed this to complications due to pregnancy. This was strange, as Zona had not told anyone that she was with child. Zona's body was then taken to the house of her mother, Mrs. Mary Jane Heaster. When mourners arrived to pay their respects, Erasmus Trout Shoe always stayed next to the open caskets, never letting anyone get close to his deceased wife. His behaviour was somewhat strange, and didn't go unnoticed by Mrs. Heaster. The following day the funeral took place. After a couple of days' mourning, Mr. Trout Shoe went back to work, and life continued for the people of Greenbrier County. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, had never approved of the marriage, and was very suspicious of her son-in-law. She believed that he knew far more about her daughter's death. The cause of it, however, had apparently been established. Zona had been laid to rest, and everyone was now going about their daily business. Mrs. Heaster was a religious lady, and in an attempt to try and contact her daughter from beyond the grave, she started to pray every night that Zona would appear and tell her how she had died. A few weeks later, Mrs. Heaster started to tell people of how she had been visited by the ghost of her daughter. At first, her story was not widely believed. The thought of Mrs. Hester's deceased daughter appearing at night, telling her mother that her death was not an accident, was something that Mrs. Hester's neighbours considered to be somewhat absurd. But as she told more people, there were those who believed what she was saying. One was her brother-in-law, a gentleman named Mr. Johnson Heaster, and together they visited the Lewisburg prosecutor, Mr. John A. Preston, to request that he open an inquiry and confirm how Zona had actually died. Mr. Preston did some investigation into Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe, a man who had not been very long in Greenbrier County. He discovered that his first wife, Miss Esterline Cutlip Macmillan, had divorced him due to his abusive behaviour, and the second wife, Mrs. Lucy Ann Tritt, had died in very mysterious circumstances. Mr. Preston then contacted Dr. Knapp, who told him that it had been very difficult to find the exact cause of Mrs. Trout-Shue's death, as whenever he tried to examine her, Mr. Trout-Shue would become very emotional and requested that he did not disturb his wife. The prosecutor concluded that a full autopsy needed to be performed and that the body of Mrs. Elva Zona Trout-Shue should be exhumed. The autopsy was performed in a nearby schoolhouse. It was found that Zona's neck had been broken and her windpipe had also been crushed. There were bruises around her neck, which had been dislocated between the first and second vertebrae. After the results of the autopsy, Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout-Shue was arrested and transported to the jail in Louisburg. He was then charged with the murder of his third wife, Mrs. Elva Zona Trout-Shue. The trial began on the 23rd of June 1897. Mrs. Mary Jane Hester gave evidence. She told how her daughter had suddenly appeared to her and explained how she had died. She told the court that when this happened, Zona said that Trout-Shue had returned home and was not pleased as she had not prepared any meat for supper. Zona then told her that she had prepared a good meal with bread and butter, apple sauce, preserves and other things, but her husband became very angry. He came towards her, taking hold of her neck and strangling her. Mrs. Hester went on to describe the house and the neighbourhood where her daughter and the defendant had lived. The judge asked her if she'd ever been there, to which Miss Hester replied that she had not. The judge was surprised by this and informed the court that he had been there many times, but would not be able to describe the area in such detail as she had. Mr. Trout-Shue had placed a sheet under his wife's head as she lay in her coffin. When the coffin was ready to be transported for burial, he removed it and left it for Mrs. Hester. Mrs. Hester said that she kept the sheet for some weeks, but eventually decided to wash it. However, when she did, it turned red in the wash tub. Over the next few days she washed it again, but was unable to remove the reddish tint. The sheet was then brought into court and presented to the jury, who all agreed that it was indeed now a reddish colour. The defence questioned Mrs. Hester at length about the visions she claimed she had had, but despite the intense questioning while she was on the witness stand, they were unable to discredit her. When they suggested that it didn't happen, she insisted that it did, and her sincerity seemed to resonate with everyone who was in court. On the sixth day of the trial, the defendant, Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout-Shue, took the stand. His appearance there, however, did nothing to convince the jury that he did not commit the act for which he was being tried. It was more an appeal to the jury, rather than a comprehensive, well-versed testimony of an innocent man. The newspaper, the Greenbrier Independent, who were reporting daily on the trial, wrote, "His testimony, manner and so forth made an unfavourable impression on the spectators." The trial lasted for 8 days before the jury was sent out to deliberate. They did so for just over an hour before they returned to find the defendant, Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout-Shue, guilty. However, 2 of the jurors voted against him receiving the death sentence, so without a unanimous decision, the judge sentenced the defendant to life in prison. The decision did not sit well with many of the residents of Greenbrier County, and on the 11th of July 1897, an armed mob marched to the local jail, where he had been placed while awaiting transportation to the state penitentiary in Moundsville. The sheriff, however, had managed to move the prisoner, and with him out of the way, persuaded the mob to go home and let justice take its course. Mr. Erasmus Stribling Trout-Shue stayed in prison until his death on the 13th of March 1900. Zona's mother, Mrs. Mary Jane Hester, died in 1916. During the years that followed the trial, she always maintained that she had indeed been visited by her deceased daughter. What is certain is that her insistence that Zona had appeared and told her how she had been murdered convinced the Louisburg prosecutor, Mr. John A. Preston, to open an investigation, and without it, Trout-Shue may have gone unpunished. There is a historical marker in Greenbrier County which commemorates the case and Zona's death. It reads, "Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer." Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As you know, I very much value all your comments and feedback, so please leave any that you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.